Welcome back to Metabolic Mind, a nonprofit initiative of Baszucki Group. And today we have another dramatic personal story. Ben Rolnik, who's lived with depression for most of his life, having suicidal thoughts at the age of 7, and just the struggle that he describes of living with depression and never knowing if you're going to have any energy for the day or if you're going to have suicidal thoughts this day, and how he sort of helped treat himself to the point where he found ketogenic therapy and how ketosis changed everything for him, where he no longer has to even think if he's going to have a bad day or if he's going to have the energy or if he can enjoy just the pure pleasure of his 18-month-old daughter. That's gone because now he knows every day he will be able to, and he attributes it to ketogenic therapy. And the other part about Ben, though, I mean, obviously just any personal story like that is amazing, but Ben is the director of the Stanford Healthcare Innovation Lab, where they are bridging the gap between technology and medicine and trying to transform healthcare with precision and personalized medicine. So having had this personal experience, his brain is now thinking, what are the next steps? How do we test and define these phenotypes so we know exactly who's going to benefit from ketogenic therapy? But also at the same time, he says, look, until we get there, it's a safe thing. Why wouldn't people try it? So Ben is in such a unique position to bridge the gap of lived experience and thinking about the research and thinking about how do we help people just like Ben? How do we give them hope? And his life was transformed. How do we transform other lives? So I hope you enjoy that message from Ben Rolnik. But first, before we get to the interview, please remember our channels for informational purposes only. We're not providing individual or group medical or healthcare advice or establishing a provider-patient relationship. Many of the things we talk about, including ketogenic diets or any changes to your medications, can be dangerous if not done without proper supervision. So please always consult your healthcare provider first before making any significant changes. So with that, I really hope you enjoy this inspiring and really encouraging interview with Ben Rolnik. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining me today on Metabolic Mind.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
So I want to give a little context. I mean, we first met because you're the director of the Healthcare Innovation Lab at Stanford University, working with Dr. Michael Snyder, and we were talking about maybe collaborating on different research ideas. But then I hear that you have this amazing personal journey that I think the world should hear about. And fortunately, you were willing to join us today to kind of tell people about your journey. So first, thank you for doing that. And second, where do you want to start about telling us your journey?
I got the chills all over my body when you said that,
Yeah.
and emotional, actually, because I've spent so many years suffering, so many years, and the way that I like to describe it is that there's no way to describe that feeling to somebody, that feeling, whatever that feeling really is. And, we try to essentially have self-reports to, kind of find ways to get at those people who are experiencing that feeling. But, it really feels like being in hell. And it feels like that the best option is suicide, not enduring it any further. And
Wow.
it is extraordinarily hard to articulate why that is in the moment, but it is such a overwhelming feeling when you're in that feeling. And I spent many years of my life, kind of going in and out of that, and trying a lot of things to escape it. And the way that I like to tell this story is that, my mother was never really into like pharmaceutical drugs and, kind of like the traditional healthcare system. And so, for the first, like, I would say 27 years of my life, like, it was the only options that were psychologically available to me were mind-body interventions, like psychotherapy, kind of self-help style work, mindfulness-based work. And I think that through that time, I really learned how to become, functional.
Hmm.
So, we could sit here and you would never know that I might be, kind of dealing with like a suicidal depressive episode or something like that. And I could sort of like white knuckle my way through having different episodes. But it was like carrying a 500-pound anchor behind me as
Wow.
I walked around. And yeah, I feel really blessed and fortunate that that pain and that suffering inspired me to, first of all, want to get out of it, and then second of all, try to help other people get out of it
Yeah.
too. Because I think that health is really our most important asset. Like I have spent a lot of time around, kind of like powerful people, wealthy people, kind of famous people, all of that. But when people have, all the fame, wealth, whatever in the world, but they're sick and they're depressed, what's the point of all of it?
Yeah.
They can't enjoy it.
Yeah,
And
it's great perspective. Yeah. So I mean, gosh, you've used such powerful imagery and terms already to give us an insight of how you were feeling. But looking back, what age do you remember feeling this like weight of depression, as you said?
um, like one of the earliest memories of this for me was, and it's one of those blurry, fuzzy images now, but it was standing in my bathroom at around 7 years old with like a bottle of Mr. Clean, wanting to drink it.
Wow.
And I don't remember the feeling then. I just remember that as an episode, and I
Mhm.
didn't do it. But I'm like, what would drive a 7-year-old, to want to do that? Like, I
Yeah.
laugh because I have a 16-month-old daughter, and like, I like throw her up in the air and she goes again, 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 and
Yeah.
like she's so happy and like so cute and all of that. And I'm like, it's always been a fascinating question to me, like what was driving, kind of that level of pain. And
Yeah.
and you know and so you could say it started then, and then basically, all the way up until the last few years of my life, where I really solved a lot of it. When I really started to go into like biology, and I was able to speak to, kind of this expert resource network that I'd found, through my time at Stanford, and, kind of with consulting with these deep experts and having a lot of time to go through the literature and just do my own level of biohacking, I made massive progress. And then, kind of much more recently, it's like turning on the keto fuse was just absolutely curative,
Yeah.
like, because I was pretty good like over the last few years. Meaning, like, again, if I had an episode, I could like white knuckle my way through, and like maybe I would just like spend a Saturday in bed longer and then like being like, how do I make it to Sunday? But then Sunday would come around and like things would like, like recalibrate pretty quickly. I don't have days like that anymore.
Wow.
Like it just,
Wow.
and by the way, I think it's really important for people to understand that, like, for who I was in that state, it was hard for me to predict my life in the future, because I never knew how I was going to feel a week from now, a month from now.
Yeah.
It wasn't consistency. And like now it's like, okay, I can fly, to a conference in Singapore or to Riyadh or to Dubai. And I'm not even like, there's no thought in my mind that I'm even going to have a bad day. And that was inconceivable to a younger self of mine.
Wow. I mean, that's so amazing, so powerful to hear that transformation. So, but part of what makes your story so unique is your position and your access to these experts and to be involved in healthcare innovation. And I mean, to have this at your disposal and to have the mind to want to research deeply. So when you said you improved most of it, what were some of the things that you found that you think helped you prior to starting ketosis? And then we'll talk more about the ketogenic journey after.
Yeah, God, so much. I mean, so yeah, so good question. I mean, the way that I break it down now is when I think about suffering, and this is sort of what I was alluding to earlier. There's lots of ways to define suffering, but like it's like if we talked about physical pain, like we don't really have language for suffering. So we could say that, I'm depressed or I'm anxious or, I feel this or that, but some of these terms are very blurry in terms of what's actually going on underneath the surface to mechanistically generate that surface level symptomatic experience. And so when I think about it, I'm like, okay, so, there are two major causes of suffering that I like to simplify in my mind. There's psychogenic causes and there's biogenic causes.
Hmm.
And so when you ask me that question, I'm like, I dealt with all the psychogenic causes. Like I systematically went through everything on the psychogenic side, from past trauma to, kind of like cognitive distortions in a CBT sense to, kind of like different types of resourceful ways of thinking and, mindset and all of that, because we can't extricate that from, we can't separate that from, what's going on in the totality of somebody who's suffering like me in that case.
Yeah.
But then once removing all of that stuff and still seeing that like something was still going wrong, right? Then the only thing that was left for me was to realize, okay, there's some biogenic stuff too, because like clearly there's something there. And, in my journey in particular, what's interesting is that I actually like the big turnaround for me there was, kind of being diagnosed with ADHD and then getting Adderall and then finding that, kind of, wow, on Adderall, I could really, kind of like those symptoms didn't quite occur in the same way. So in terms of my experience, I made a distinction around the psychogenic causes of my suffering and the biogenic causes. And they get really mixed and intertwined, but it's sort of like, you can't treat, kind of biogenic suffering with, psychological interventions, just like you can't treat, biogenic suffering with psychological interventions. And I think a lot of people, myself included, for years, just don't understand that fundamentally. And it's like, if they're dealing with, kind of the types of problems that we're talking about the ketogenic diet solving by seeing a therapist to talk about their childhood trauma, they're never going to get better. I'm sorry. It's just not like, and I don't mean that as an insult to those therapists. I actually think that serves a purpose of elevating their consciousness and making them, wiser, kind of more effective human beings. But if it's around that feeling that they're trying to resolve or cure, it's not about psychological trauma. It's about their biology. And this is something that like I feel very passionate about because I feel like I spent, over 20 years of my life trying to solve a biogenic problem, biogenic suffering with psychological interventions. And they were very effective to some extent, but they never got to like the root cause. And it's just sort of like, if I could have told my younger self this, it would have, I don't know, it would have changed my life trajectory. I would have suffered way less. So I was telling you a bit about like what I discovered on the biogenic side, so like Adderall was one of like, kind of the first like psychopharmaceuticals that I really, kind of took that I found incredible, kind of relief from. I mean, Adderall is an incredibly powerful, kind of molecule, but, it also, I call it like a devil's bargain. And, there's a lot that people don't know about Adderall, like, for example, I think there was a research article that I read that basically showed like an 8x increase in the incidence of Parkinson's and neurodegenerative disorders from long-term Adderall users. And, in my own mind, it kind of makes sense. I mean, like, first of all, the way that you're diagnosed and, kind of prescribed an amphetamine in this country is like shockingly simple. I've asked the adult Harvard ADHD scale to hundreds of people. I've not met one person that doesn't qualify for, an Adderall prescription here in the US. And so it's not a very sharp instrument to get into what's really causing, you to essentially need that medication. And then, essentially like, who really needs it in the first place, blah, blah, blah. But then on another side, it's also like ravaging, your dopamine system and your dopamine neurons. And, it's sort of like who I was on Adderall was, like it was incredibly powerful for like some of those feelings and like making me like operational and productive in, kind of like despite, kind of what was going on, I guess, cerebrally. But I couldn't match the pace of my wife, for example, like in a relationship basis. And I think that this is like actually a great study that someone should do. But, seeing how many divorces occur when people go on, stimulants and they sort of like, they end up getting out of resonance with their partners because they're going 100 miles per hour, and they'll say they're going slower, and it's a
Yeah.
complicated dynamic there, but their partner is seeing them like in just differently, like it
Yeah.
just, they change a little bit.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, so it's interesting. I mean, Adderall clearly had a pretty profound effect on you, but not without concerns, but still
yeah.
with episodes of depression, it sounds like. It didn't completely eliminate your episodes of depression. And so
Well, I think,
what eventually
yeah.
led you to seek out ketosis as another treatment?
Yeah, and by the way, I mean, I don't want to say, like, oh, it was just Adderall. Like, I also experimented with SSRIs and, kind of like other different types of interventions. And, it's like everything kind of had its place,
Yeah.
within the ecosystem. And, like, I mean, I'm a huge fan of medications and molecules. Like, I think it's like, I mean, humans have done incredible, bringing these things to life. But essentially what happened was, like, how do I put it? Like, I got off Adderall, so, I weaned off, which is hard in and of itself. That's a whole separate conversation that we could talk about. But and then I went into more of like the biohacking, kind of like, kind of way. And I had a very deep, like, kind of functional strategy for myself with, kind of targeted concentrated nutrients and, different like supplemental molecules to help stimulate pathways, so like you have, for example, like your, kind of L-tyrosine, for essentially production of dopamine and stimulating that with P5P. There's a whole deep literature and rabbit hole on that. And the thing is that I got a lot better, like on a functional day-to-day basis. Like, I was operating at a much, much higher level than I had been previously, but under episodes of deep stress. And like, this is where all the pieces start to make a lot more sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, what happens? Well, okay, like diet changes, like I could end up eating more. It's a lot easier in our world to like eat carbs, like carbs are, basically all of our like CPG style foods. Like, it's like easier for me to like spoon up some like oatmeal that, kind of like I, kind of poured hot water into, than it is for me to like make like, kind of a salad and a keto meal and, fillet of fish and, saute it. It's just like, especially when I'm a busy person doing all of this stuff. And so I think that, like, looking back, and a lot of this is, is fascinating because I'll get in a minute to like even a deeper rabbit hole that I went down for my specific genotype that to me was like almost confirmatory around
Yeah.
why I should be on the ketogenic diet, which, like, again, if I had known younger, I would have experimented with it and I would have said to myself, oh my God, this is why I have these up days and I have these down days. And I'm like not understanding why, because I'm thinking to myself, I'm eating healthy. It's like, look, like I know that, apples don't really make me feel good, but like, oranges and bananas and like other things, like, great, why not? Let me just load them up because everyone says that these are healthy foods, right? And so I think that there was a lot of that in there where it's like you combine like high stress, high demand, and, also like having a wife and, kind of a newborn baby. And, it all sort of hit a, kind of like a crisis peak for me where, I was like, I do not want to be the father for my child who has off days.
Yeah.
Like I can't afford that. Like I could do that as a, kind of a single guy. I could do that even kind of, with a wife, but like with a daughter, she's not going to understand that like I need to take off at like, 6 p.m. and just, kind of close the curtains, or like during the weekend, I need like a serious recovery break. Like she's only going to understand I'm not there, I'm not available,
Yeah.
daddy doesn't love me. And then it's
No,
heartbreaking for me too, you know?
that is
And
heartbreaking.
so, yeah. And so I was like, I can't, like, I was determined for my daughter, and for me too, but she was good motivation, but,
Yeah.
like really determined for my daughter to not
Yeah.
be that anymore.
I love
And
that imagery of you throwing her up in the air and catching her. Like, you don't want to miss that. That's like key to
I mean,
happiness in life.
and like, and Brett, it's just like, I can't, there are people that might listen to this that never experience the feeling that I'm talking about. And they never experienced it on such a variable schedule where they were like, I have no idea what's wrong with me. Like, why is this happening? I feel like I'm doing everything right. And then this will come out of nowhere. And it won't even come out based on like a bad event. It'll just happen. I'll be like happy, happy, happy. And then all of a sudden, it's just like, why am I waking up feeling like I have no energy and that I can't get out of bed? And it's just a slog to get through the day. And I can't think. My brain is foggy. I can't remember anything. And it just felt like everything was offline. And I was like, it's not because my life is bad, like it's not any of that. And I knew enough that it was biological. And I had developed a thesis for myself that any feeling that I ever have must necessarily be 100% biological. It must be, because it's a neurochemical event. Something is happening in my brain to generate me feeling like that. And so if I could figure out the root cause mechanism and I could attack that mechanism, then I could solve my problem. And so that's what it became about. But again, I tried a bunch of different things and I was like, these are helping, but they're not getting there. And then basically, it hit like kind of a crisis point where I had a lot of stress on my plate. There was also family stress too, where it's just like I had more responsibilities for my daughter Leela, and kind of my wife was going through stuff, and then it was like I couldn't handle it. It was just too much, and I was like, I need to do something. I need to take another deep stab at this, and that's actually where I, kind of like found and read. Well, actually, it was during the time of collaborating with you guys and starting that conversation, because we started, like, I think probably met about a year ago or so. And so like, I knew that you were doing this research. I knew ketogenic diets were really interesting. And then basically I heard about Chris Palmer's book, Brain Energy. And I was like, let's tie all these pieces together and let me just, go for this and just see if this does it for me. And sure enough, like I go keto my first week, I'm like, whoa. I'm like, wait, what? I'm like, this is amazing.
Yeah, that quick, that
Yeah.
dramatic, huh?
Oh, that dramatic. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it was like, I mean, like I remember like, okay, it's like cutting out the carbs, I forgot the days of the week, but like, let's just say it was a Monday, very hard. Like Monday, Tuesday, maybe part of Wednesday, I'm like struggling. I took a full sick week, cause like I didn't try to power through. I was just like, I'm in a bad state. I need to go down, and like, and recover here. And, and, and I'm like, okay, so Monday, Tuesday, I'm like, this is going to be horrible. I'm going to need 4 weeks. Maybe I need to quit my job. Like maybe I need to like rearrange my whole life, yeah, because I was like, I need to do something. I was like, I cannot live like this for the rest of my life, and I can't show up like that for my daughter and my family. And then basically, on like Wednesday-ish, there's like this turnaround event where it's just like I kind of pop open. It's like the lights kind of came on.
Yeah.
And like and you know, like, and I remember kind of going a little bit slow from that point, being like, I'm not going to like crank it up too far, but I'm going to like, this is a real signal. And then I started exercising again that week. And like, I hadn't wanted to exercise for a while because to me, it was like, it was a variable event. I was like, I'm going to spend energy. And then am I going to get it back the next day? Am I going to feel better? Am I going to feel worse? So it felt too risky sometimes to have a habitual exercise habit. And then I was like, okay, I'm exercising. That feels great. And then I just got stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And, the only kind of quote unquote bad days that I've had, I can directly link to like some carbs that I ate. Like it's like that clear of a signal, even to the point that like at first my wife was like, like let me feed you this carb, like oh you don't like come on please eat this, like oh we're all eating it, it's so great, to the point where she was like you're never eating carbs again,
Even she could tell the direct correlation.
yeah.
She's like, "Oh no, cutting you off."
Really,
Yeah.
really, because it's that profound. Because like I would tell her, the next day afterwards, I'm like waking up in the morning going, I don't have energy, or like Leela's waking us up at 3 a.m. And instead of me being able to pop up with energy, and it's the easiest way to describe it. This word energy, language, and all of this is very important. Again, we don't have great language to describe the phenomenological, subjective experience that someone has that are going through states that I'm describing, before and after keto or with whatever problems I've had. But it feels like energy. It feels like now Leela can wake me up at 3 a.m. and like I'm ready to go. I'm
Yeah.
not like zombie and like thinking like how do I survive this and then
Yeah.
worried about the next day. It just doesn't happen like that anymore. And it also fixed my gut too. Like, I used to have like IBS. I mean, without being too graphic, like I didn't had solid, kind of doo-doos for like years. It was just became a part of life. Like, it's like who has solid doo-doos? I just go. And then it's like, wow, that got fixed too. And yeah, and a lot of stuff. And I think I told you this kind of going into it, that like one of the things that I discovered for myself going down this rabbit hole, because I'm very fascinated, and I think that there's a lot of kind of work in terms of like personalization in like all commercially available genotyping
Yeah.
that actually sets thresholds, personalized thresholds, from everything from like clinical blood lab values to expectations of kind of maybe things that like could explain your symptoms better than any type of clinical blood labs that we have
Yeah.
today can explain. And when I went down the rabbit hole, because I'm an APOE4 dual carrier, and Peter Attia talks a lot about this, about like I heard him mention like like that APOE4 people spike a lot, and they spike in like an unusual way to glucose. And I started like investigating this a little bit more about the relationship between APOE4 and insulin resistance. And what I discovered was totally mind blowing. And like when I went deeper into my genotype, I was just like, whoa, there's a major smoking gun here that, had I known just as an experimental biohacker when I was younger, I would have for sure been like, maybe I should try keto, and my entire life, would be different. So
Yeah. Did you ever test yourself for insulin resistance? Because that's also something that we just don't do enough of in medicine, right? We follow fasting blood sugar, hemoglobin A1C, but that just doesn't even hardly scratch the surface for insulin resistance. So,
yeah,
you like to meddle, you like to test, you like to tinker. So did you get into
yes,
that?
you're giving me the chills all over my body, because the big discovery that I made for myself, and when I went into the literature, is that cerebral insulin resistance and peripheral insulin resistance are actually not fully correlated. Meaning you can have cerebral insulin resistance without peripheral insulin resistance. And so that means that like all of those like fasting glucose tests that I did, and hemoglobin A1C tests that I did, and like I was tested for that, there was no signal there.
How about
And
fasting insulin or HOMA IR? Did you check
I don't know
those?
if I took that.
Yeah.
Yeah, would that have picked it up, you
It
think?
might have. So this disconnect probably has to do with we need more sensitive testing. Well, or may have to do with needing more sensitive testing, because hemoglobin A1C and fasting glucose will catch it, but way late, like when insulin resistance has been going on for years or even decades in some cases. So
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
part of it is a new paradigm in how we measure and test. Yeah.
Yeah, you give me the chills, because when I went into like the pathophysiology of Alzheimer's disease, which my genotype is 8 to 12x more likely to develop, it actually is fully relating to cerebral insulin resistance, especially in the hippocampus. And what blew my mind was that, there was one study in particular that showed that individuals with that genotype as early as 20 years old are starting to display the same levels of cerebral insulin resistance as someone with full on Alzheimer's dementia later in life.
At 20
And
years
I was
old.
just
Wow.
20. So they're dealing with that for decades
Yeah.
before it turns into dementia. And I would complain to my mom and I would basically be like, why am I losing my memory? Like, what
Mm.
is going on? Like, I can't remember things the same way anymore. My brain is really foggy. And like everyone would just say, like, nah. It's like, this is normal. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure this is not normal. Like, my
Yeah.
brain is not holding on to things, it's not grasping things. And I'm like, whoa, I don't have the hard data on that. But I mean, it is to me like the surest smoking gun and like a hypothesis that is certainly worth exploring much more deeply.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's update us though. You talked about when you started ketogenic diet
Yeah.
and how after day 3, it was such a dramatic change. How long has it been and what else has changed or stayed the same?
Yeah, thanks. So it's been roughly about like 6 months or so. And what I can say is that it's like everything is different. Everything is fundamentally different. And what I mean by that is that it's like my ability to maintain a constant, level of high performance is just there. It's just dialed in, it's locked in. I don't drop down. I don't have bad days. I don't have like waking up at 3 a.m. and like feeling like I'm not going to make it throughout the rest of the day because it's just like that stuff is gone, even to the point where like I remember, kind of a year ago or so, it's like the thought on like a Saturday of going and taking, kind of Leela to the park and, doing fun stuff with her. It was like, what were my choices? To like spend time with my daughter or to like rest and recover? And my choice would, vacillate between the two. But like in my mind, I was like, I need to rest and recover. Whereas now that doesn't exist for me. And I would say the hardest part for me now is, and this is, I think, probably a really fascinating thing for anyone who's getting onto this diet, is dealing with carb addiction. Because now I'm an addict and I have to deal with my addiction to carbs because I know how I react. Like I've proven it to myself what goes on when, kind of I overload on carbs. But the thing is that that doesn't mean that when I look at the pumpkin pie or I'm stressed out or I haven't slept that much the night before, I don't like my brain doesn't scream at me to go eat those types of foods.
Okay. So the cravings and the draw has decreased.
Oh, I mean significantly.
Yeah.
Like, I would say that like I manage cravings extremely well, but I do want to make like, kind of a statement to it that, it's kind of like that AA adage that like once you're an addict, you're always an addict. And it's like I will tell you, hopefully today and for the rest of my life, I am a sugar addict. I am a carb addict. I don't eat them right now, but I am addicted. And, the thing is that, if I don't keep that in front of me, then I probably would make choices that today that would make me feel horrible tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then it becomes actually a vicious cycle because then the worse I feel, the more I actually want to eat carbs. And it's a dirty trick
Mm.
of my mind. I don't know if that's the
Yeah.
same for others,
Such a
but
powerful realization. I mean, to have that insight is just so powerful in helping you stay in control. And so looking back over the past, 20 years and the way you felt and the way you've cycled, did you ever think you would get to the point where you didn't have to think about depression or worry about depression? Did you ever think that would be your life?
not really.
Yeah.
Um, I definitely visualized it and prayed for it and hoped for it,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
you know, but my day-to-day reality could not prove to me over a long enough span of time that it was actually possible, that I truly figured it out.
Yeah.
And there was a stack that I was on I would say like a year ago or so that I did think was that, and like, and the thing is that, and it was incredibly healing and incredibly powerful for me, but it wasn't this, because like, I think now at this point, I'm fundamentally convinced that based on my genotype, like I do much better on a ketogenic diet over time. And I don't really understand the science well enough now to understand like eventually do I go back and I can introduce carbs and not have symptoms. But where I'm at now, I'm like, I would very happily spend the rest of my life, fully like eliminating carbs and sugars, because the way I feel on the other side of it is just so much more worth it. I get
Yeah,
I get a full life back, like full vitality back.
that's so
And the
great to
work that
hear.
the work that you guys do is so important. Like, I mean, oh my God. Like, you know how many people are being mistreated and misdiagnosed that are like me that just need an intervention like this that would radically change their life. And instead, they're going to be put on all the wrong drugs
Yeah.
for maybe decades, and they're going to get worse problems because of that. I mean, it's tragic. It's really, really tragic.
Well, so let's bring your worlds together here, right? We've heard your amazing story, but now related to your job, right? Precision medicine, improving healthcare through personalized precision medicine. How do you see a ketogenic intervention fitting in, and where should we start?
So it's a really good question. And obviously we're asking this question together right now as organizations. And and I I mean, the simple answer is I don't know today. I mean, I think what I hypothesize is that we're going to discover subtypes that if we know that you're one of those subtypes when you're, kind of like 6 months old, like we're going to have a completely different lifestyle recommendation to you than we do to normal kids. Like your parents will know, they'll understand. They're not going to give you, kind of cornflakes in the morning and, feed you porridge. Like, it'll be guiding your entire life as you get older. And then I think for the people that, are currently in treatment right now, for whatever they happen to be in treatment for, and I think this is part of like the really mind-blowing concept of this, that, the way that Chris Palmer describes it is that, it's like you don't like call, kind of like influenza, COVID, pneumonia, whatever, like runny nose disease, like sore throat disease, and like cough disease.
Yeah.
You look at what is the root cause of, kind of those symptoms, and you treat the root cause. And for so many mental health disorders, we're not treating the root cause. We're just basically saying, oh, you have, runny nose disease. Let's just treat your runny nose disease. But that endophenotype is continuing, unscathed. And I think that that's what we're discovering. We're discovering those endophenotypes. We're really getting to that place of precision medicine and precision care. And so I think that I think we're definitely going to discover those. We'll for sure discover like those subtypes to the point that like, if you are one of them, we're going to say to you, okay, this is exactly what you do. You're going to be cured. Like, wipe our hands clean. Now it's easy. Like, hallelujah, that's an easy case. I mean, the challenge will be having people like get on a diet like this and stick to the diet and deal with their addiction. That's a whole separate story that we'll also have to figure out, because that also requires another way of looking at somebody's data and what they need. And then I think that we're going to also discover a lot of really fascinating edge cases. And I think that, it's hard to know right now what those are, because, part of what makes Mike Snyder's approach at Stanford and, his whole longitudinal multi-omic baseline profiling shtick just so powerful is that, there are certain questions that you can't answer today if you didn't gather, kind of this exquisitely deep data over the last year, 2 years, 3 years. And it's not just about gathering a bunch of deep data. What we've learned is that you also have to gather the right data with the right types of annotations, the right types of, connection points, so that when you look back a year from now, you're not asking yourself like, what is that signal right there? And you have no way to analyze it, for the level of precision and specificity and subtlety that we really want to deliver like true personalized healthcare. And so I think that that's what we have the opportunity to do, to really see, kind of what are, the deep endophenotypes, kind of that generate the symptoms that this is a treatment addresses. And then how do you essentially like create the full, kind of just cornucopia of subtypes, so to speak, that might require like one or two or three additional things within their stack, within their treatment protocols that address the totality of their symptoms so that they get to wake up tomorrow feeling amazing and like having a
Yeah.
great life and not worrying about episodes and symptoms and all this stuff that gets in the way.
It's a great vision. I mean, it's a fantastic vision. And that's why I think part of what makes your story so special, not just the amazing personal journey, but having the thought process and the possibility to then take it to the next level and say, this happened to me. How can I help other people have the same? And how can we identify them? Well, at the same time, having to come up with strategies to not eat your daughter's mac and cheese or pizza or whatever's laying around, right? You've got to bring it all
Yes.
together. And so far you're finding a way. And I appreciate you
Yeah.
sharing that with us.
Well, we're all pioneering this way. I mean, I think that the biggest thing that I recognize is that no one should have to suffer like I did. It's just not necessary. Like there's no like purpose to it. It's not a good thing. It's not ideal. And I think that now at this point, it's like when my endophenotype, is really well characterized and known, then anyone who's kind of like me, it's like this is what they need to do. And there's not guesswork about it. We're not like wondering and scratching our heads. It's not like you need to go see three specialists and they all have different opinions. It's like there is one ground fundamental truth that we can discover to help people.
Yeah.
And to me, that's it's not that far away. Like I think that we're getting close to that place, and I think that the people that are struggling today need to know that there's hope. Like there really
Yeah.
is. Like and to that point, it's like even if what they're going through right now is hell and they cannot see a way out of it beyond suicide because they're just like so overwhelmed by the level of their suffering and kind of a lack of kind of a positive foreseeable future, that they're going to get out of that mindset, like that they will be able to be taken out of that and like be back in this heavenly world that we have. And it can happen that fast too when they find the right combination of things and the right treatment. And I think what we're talking about here with keto is incredibly safe. Like we're not talking about anything that is like seriously dangerous. And it's accessible to anyone today. Doesn't like cost a ton of money. In fact, it could actually end up costing you less money when you do it right.
Yeah.
And it just has all of the pros. There's no reason not to have it on the list as like a first line protocol.
That's a wonderful vision too, right? I mean, it'd be great to phenotype everybody and know exactly who's going to benefit. But in the meantime, why wouldn't you try it? Because exactly like you said, I think you summed it up so well. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's probably performance benefits too. Like you hear performance athletes that kind of experiment with diets like this,
Yeah.
and so it's like it goes beyond just the concept of like curing disease and issues and illnesses.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm grateful. I mean, look, if it wasn't for the work that you guys are doing, like I probably wouldn't have done this. I myself,
Now you're giving
and
me
that's
chills.
really, I mean, it's so important. I mean, I have so much respect for, kind of what, kind of your entire team and Jan have done and the pioneering spirit on that, because I've been in this world of philanthropy, at Stanford, now for a number of years. And philanthropists are really angels on earth. I mean, they don't get nearly enough credit for the work that they do, because it's like, look, we give a lot of like credit to venture capitalists, like they scaled a business, they became a billionaire, and it's like, ooh, it gets our greed thing going. But the reality is that, like we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. We wouldn't be progressing the science. We wouldn't actually be getting to the answers that fast forward 25 years time from now, when my daughter is at school with all of her friends and somebody's suffering, Like they get a direct answer immediately that cures them, that doesn't just like mortgage their symptoms and their pain for later. And that's because of the work that you're doing. That's because you guys, decided that you're going to invest your hard-earned money in solving this problem and investigating it further, not knowing what's going to come out of it. And I just think that it takes so much courage, and it's like a thankless job for, in so many ways, because the people that you help are going to have no idea in a lot of ways that you were the cause of them being helped. But I'm so grateful for you, like really. And yeah, thank you. Look, I have a
That's
life back because of this.
Yeah, and that's the message. That's what we want people to hear. You have a life back because of this, and others can too. So thank you tremendously. Thank you for sharing your journey, for sharing your message of hope, and for helping us trying to connect the dots with the science, the genotype, the phenotype, and just wanting to feel better. So we'll direct people to your Twitter and your X account at Ben Rolnik, and we look forward to hearing more from you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. This was fun.
Thanks, Ben.